In 1953, over 2,500 people lost their lives when the North Sea broke through Europe's defenses, a memory that haunts today's rising tides. Now, scientists are seriously debating a plan so vast it would wall off entire seas to shield 25 million people from climate disaster. The North European Enclosure Dam sounds like science fiction, yet it's capturing headlines and dividing experts. Could this be our last hope against flooding, or the most dangerous gamble Europe has ever considered? The answer starts with the history and uncertainty that drive such extreme ideas. Night fell on January 31st, 1953, as a fierce wind howled over the North Sea. In the darkness, a storm surge struck the Dutch coast with little warning. Water crashed through more than 150 dikes, flooding villages and farmland, sweeping away homes and leaving entire communities stranded on rooftops. By morning, the devastation stretched from the Netherlands to eastern England and Belgium. The death toll climbed past 2,500, over 1,800 in the Netherlands alone. Survivors recalled the terror of waking to a wall of black water, the desperate scramble for higher ground, and the silence that followed as the floodwaters receded, revealing a landscape forever changed. For the Netherlands, a country with nearly a third of its land below sea level, the disaster was more than a tragedy. It was a call to action. In the weeks that followed, the Dutch government pledged that such a catastrophe would never happen again. Engineers and planners mobilized, launching the Delta Works, one of the world's most ambitious civil engineering projects. The plan called for a vast network of dams, storm surge barriers, and reinforced dikes designed to shield the lowlands from the relentless threat of the sea. Construction began in 1953, and over the following decades, the Delta Works would reshape the Dutch coastline, setting a new standard for coastal defense. In Britain, the floodwaters swept into the Thames estuary, submerging neighborhoods and prompting a national reckoning. The memory of water lapping at the steps of Parliament spurred decades of debate, and eventually the construction of the Thames Barrier. Across Northern Europe, the 1953 flood left a legacy of vigilance, a deep-seated fear that the sea could return at any moment, and a determination to build ever stronger defenses. A Dutch engineer reflecting on the Delta Works years later captured the national mood: "We do not fight the water, we live with it, but we will not let it win." For survivors and engineers alike, the lesson was clear: nature's power could not be ignored, but it could be met with resolve and ingenuity. That promise, "never again," still echoes through Europe's flood-prone coastlines, shaping how nations think about risk, resilience, and the lengths they are willing to go to keep the sea at bay. Global sea levels have risen by about 21 centimeters since 1880. That number might seem small at first glance. Yet for Europe's low-lying coastlines, even modest increases have changed the odds. Today, what used to be considered a 100-year flood can strike multiple times in a single generation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warns that under high-emission scenarios, sea levels could climb by as much as 2 meters by the year 2100. Such a rise would redraw the map of Northern Europe. Yet the North Sea basin is especially exposed. Its shores are lined with sprawling delta systems: the Rhine-Meuse Scheldt in the Netherlands and Belgium, the Elbe in Germany, the Thames in England, and the Seine in France. Yet these deltas are home to millions, and they host some of the world's busiest ports and industrial centers. In the Netherlands, sea defenses are engineered to withstand about 1 additional meter of rise. Beyond that, the cost and complexity of protection surge and the margin for error shrinks. A climate scientist at the Royal Netherlands Institute for Sea Research describes the problem in stark terms. If current trends continue, the North Sea's lowlands will become increasingly difficult to defend. Every additional centimeter of sea level rise makes extreme flooding more likely. The numbers back this up. By 2100, a 2-meter rise would put more than 25 million people at risk across the North Sea's coastal nations. Critical infrastructure, power plants, airports, and data centers sit just meters above current high tide lines. The threat is not just theoretical. Major storms now ride on top of higher baseline sea levels, amplifying their destructive reach. When the St. Jude storm battered Northern Europe in 2013, it served as another warning. The combination of rising seas and stronger storms is a recipe for disaster. In the face of these projections, traditional defenses, dikes, levees, and barriers begin to look less like permanent solutions and more like temporary measures. As the risks escalate, so does the pressure to consider options that once seemed unthinkable. For scientists and policymakers, the question is no longer whether the sea will rise, but how far and how quickly Europe must adapt to keep its coastlines above water. Draw a line from the cliffs of Cornwall to the rocky coast of Brittany, and you trace the southern boundary of the North Sea basin. This imagined barrier, stretching roughly 161 kilometers across the mouth of the English Channel, would seal off the Atlantic from the low-lying lands behind it. Now look north. From the northeast tip of Scotland, the route leaps across the Orkney and Shetland Islands, then pushes eastward over open water to reach the Norwegian coast near Bergen. This northern segment covers about 476 kilometers, nearly 3 times the length of the Channel crossing. Together, these two lines would form a continuous wall enclosing the entire North Sea, transforming a vast expanse of open water into a protected basin. Within this perimeter lie the shores of the United Kingdom, Norway, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. The enclosure would also touch the outlets to the Baltic Sea and the Irish Sea, drawing in a patchwork of coastlines and national borders. Major river deltas, the Rhine, Elbe, Thames, and Scheldt, feed into this basin, carrying the runoff of millions of square kilometers of European land. The proposed dams would not simply skirt the edges of these countries, they would redraw the physical boundary between land and sea on a continental scale. For the first time, the shape of Europe's northern coastline would be determined not by geology or tides, but by human design. The sheer length, over 600 kilometers in total, underscores the magnitude of what is being imagined, a single engineered structure larger than any dam or barrier ever built, stretching from the Celtic Sea to the Norwegian fjords. Behind the imagined walls of a North Sea dam lies more than a stretch of reclaimed coastline or a line drawn on a map. Here, nearly 25 million people live and work, families in Dutch polder towns, commuters in Hamburg and London, dock workers in Antwerp, and entire city districts in Copenhagen, Bremen, and Rotterdam. These are not just numbers, but neighbors, schools, hospitals, and the daily pulse of some of Europe's most productive regions. The protected zone would encompass the world's largest port in Rotterdam, the industrial heartlands of Germany and Belgium, and sprawling agricultural plains that help feed the continent. Airports, power stations, and data centers, vital links in Europe's infrastructure, sit just a few meters above the waterline. For these communities, the threat is not distant or abstract. A surge of the North Sea could mean the loss of homes, jobs, and entire ways of life. The memory of floodwaters in city streets, of rescue boats weaving through neighborhoods, still shapes local identity. In the Netherlands alone, 2 out of 5 residents live below sea level, relying on dikes and pumps for their safety. Extending protection across the whole basin would, in theory, secure the future of millions more. But the scale of what is at stake is staggering. Not just property and farmland, but the social fabric of countries that have built their lives in defiance of the sea. The question is no longer about defending a single village or city. It is about safeguarding the continuity of entire nations, about deciding who gets to remain behind the walls and at what cost. 51 billion tons of sand. That is the estimated amount needed just to build the core of the North Sea Dam, an amount equal to what the entire world uses in a year for all construction and manufacturing. The numbers only get more daunting from there. At its deepest point, the northern barrier would have to cross the Norwegian Trench, plunging 321 meters below the surface. No dam or dike on Earth comes close to that depth. The world's seawall in South Korea is less than 1/10 as long, and it rises from much shallower water. To keep the rivers of Europe from backing up and flooding the lowlands behind the dam, a network of pumping stations would need to move 40,000 cubic meters of water every second, 80 times the capacity of the largest stations in use today. Each of these figures stands on its own as a kind of warning. The scale of materials, the challenge of building in deep, rough seas, the unending task of moving entire rivers over artificial walls. Engineers who have studied the need proposal speak in terms usually reserved for space missions or wartime mobilization. The logistics of sourcing, transporting, and placing that much sand and rock would require a global fleet of dredgers and decades of continuous effort. Even for nations with the tradition of fighting the sea, the sheer magnitude of the project forces a new kind of calculation.
Not just can it be done, but what would it take to even try? A project of this magnitude would demand not only unprecedented resources, but an extraordinary commitment of time. The original need proposal used a 20-year construction period as a basis for cost modeling, but even its authors acknowledged that real-world execution could stretch toward a century. Building more than 600 kilometers of dam across some of the roughest seas in Europe means working through storms, seasons, and shifting political tides for generations, and every segment would require careful sequencing. Shallow sections might progress faster, but the deep Norwegian trench at over 300 meters would slow even the most ambitious schedule. Sourcing and moving 51 billion tons of sand would test the limits of global supply chains. Fleets of dredgers and supply vessels would operate year-round, coordinating deliveries from distant borrow sites to the evolving dam line. Each kilometer completed would be only a small step in a process measured not in years, but in decades. The logistics would ripple outward. New quarries, expanded ports, and dedicated transport corridors would spring up across the region, reshaping local economies as much as coastlines. Navigation cannot be an afterthought. The English Channel is the world's busiest shipping lane, and the North Sea is a highway for global trade. To keep ports like Rotterdam, Hamburg, and London connected, the barrier would need a network of giant locks and gates, structures on a scale never attempted. Each lock introduces a new layer of risk, complexity, and maintenance. Supply lines for workers, materials, and machinery would need to remain open for generations, and every delay, be it political, technical, or environmental, could cascade across the entire timeline. The sheer duration and operational complexity make the North Sea Dam less a single project than a rolling multi-decade campaign. Even before the first stone is set, planners would have to confront not just how to build the dam, but how to keep a living, working Europe running around it. Closing off the North Sea would set in motion a transformation that reaches far beyond the shoreline. Without the twice-daily ebb and flow of tides, the basin would lose its main engine for mixing salt and fresh water. Over the first few years, river inflows from the Rhine, Elbe, Thames, and other major rivers would steadily dilute the sea, turning vast stretches of saltwater brackish. By year 5, the southern and central North Sea would already show a sharp drop in salinity, with levels falling from around 34 parts per thousand to the mid-20s. Dogger Bank, once a thriving marine plateau, would shift from a saltwater ecosystem to one more like the Baltic, less saline, less dynamic, and less able to support the species that have defined North Sea fisheries for centuries. The loss of tidal energy would leave the water column more stratified, especially in summer. In deeper areas, oxygen would become scarce as stratification cuts off mixing with surface waters. Marine ecologists warn that these conditions are a recipe for hypoxia, so-called dead zones where little can survive. The North Sea's famous productivity, built on the constant churning of nutrients and oxygen, would fade. Plankton communities would change, altering the base of the food web. Cod, herring, and flatfish would struggle to reproduce or even survive as their spawning grounds lose the conditions they depend on. On Dogger Bank, the shift in salinity and sediment would drive out marine invertebrates and fish, opening the door for brackish and even freshwater species, but at a fraction of the former biomass. Testimony from marine ecologists is blunt. Enclosing the North Sea would collapse its current ecosystem within decades. The fisheries, the seabirds, the seals, all would be forced to adapt, relocate, or disappear. The sheer scale of these changes challenges not just local livelihoods, but the very idea of what the North Sea is and what it means for Europe's natural heritage. The price tag for enclosing the North Sea is staggering. Estimates range from 250 billion euros to 500 billion euros, with some projections climbing even higher. That sum would need to be shared among the United Kingdom, Norway, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Dividing the cost is only the beginning. Each country would have to agree not just on funding, but on who decides how the dam is built, operated, and maintained over generations. Legal liability for failures, environmental damage, and even the right to open or close navigation gates would demand new treaties and constant negotiation. A policy ethicist from Rotterdam points out the project's scale blurs the line between national infrastructure and a global experiment. This is not just about saving cities like Rotterdam or Hamburg. It is about deciding collectively to reshape the sea itself. For coastal fishers in Denmark and the United Kingdom, the prospect
feels even more distant. Many wonder if the benefits will ever reach their communities, or if they will bear the costs of lost fisheries and disrupted livelihoods while distant capitals debate technicalities. Alternatives do exist. The Dutch have invested in room for the river, moving dikes back to restore floodplains and reduce risk without sealing off the coast. The United Kingdom's Thames Estuary 2100 plan looks at flexible upgrades to barriers and dikes, not a single megastructure. Nature-based solutions, restoring wetlands, dunes, and salt marshes cost less, support biodiversity, and can buffer storm surges, but none offer the same promise of permanent protection against extreme sea level rise. The real decision is not just about money or engineering, it is about whose future is being secured, who gets a voice, and whether the ultimate cost is one Europe is willing or able to pay. Right now, need remains only a thought experiment, yet the fact that scientists seriously model a 476-kilometer dam across the North Sea signals how rapidly climate risks are escalating. As sea levels rise, the boundaries of what societies consider possible or acceptable will shift. The real question is not about engineering limits, but about the choices we make before those limits are reached. Where would you draw the line?